We have more for your ears only. I'm Catherine Herzog.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. Some third world country. That was a decidedly undiplomatic Vice President Joe Biden on New York's LaGuardia Airport in contrast to sophisticated Hong Kong International. Now this.
What about Lebanon? It's falling apart because of Syria. Look at Iraq. Syria is a cancer. It has to be contained, and we could.
A top U.S. Army general says thousands of Marines could soon be redeployed to Africa as part of America's so-called global realignment.
South Carolina's Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, just back from the Middle East, has reasserted his call for more military assistance, though not U.S. boots on the ground. So moderate rebel forces in Syria have a fighting chance against al-Qaeda-linked extremists and the forces of President Bashir al-Assad. And Sky News reports actual Marine boots moving into Africa to counter growing terrorist threats in key areas there. Meanwhile, Washington is angling for ways to keep a reduced but nimble force in Afghanistan while sending more weaponry back to Iraq to fight extremists emboldened by the earlier withdrawal of U.S. forces there.
And behind the scenes, military strategists and number crunchers are calculating how to best apportion a Pentagon budget whose growth can no longer maintain the pace it enjoyed before the fiscal collapse. The Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments was one of several think tanks comparing their analyses in Washington last week. And to talk about some of the conclusions for your ears only, the CSBA's Todd Harrison, Senior Fellow in Defense Budget Studies, joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Talk about the different budget levels you experts used as parameters in projecting how much to spend for what purposes compared with existing budget limits.
Sure. So what we did in this exercise is we gave all the teams two different budget scenarios. The first scenario was what we called the full BCA cuts. That's the Budget Control Act. Those are the budget caps that are actually in effect right now in the law, and that requires about a $330 billion reduction in Pentagon spending compared to the budget they proposed last year over the next 10 years. And then we went back and we asked all the teams to give us their approach under a second fiscal scenario that had lesser cuts. So if, for instance, if Congress restored some of that money, what would the teams do differently? And that level of cut was only $200 billion over the next 10 years. So those are the two fiscal scenarios that all of the teams went through in this exercise.
One overriding shift your CSBA team underscored was from compellence force to deterrence force. What's the difference in purpose, strategy, and equipment involved?
Well, a compellence force is what the U.S. military has traditionally had since the end of World War II, and that's a force that's designed to be able to go in, invade, take territory, kick someone out. A deterrence force is really designed to operate differently, where you would do two things. If someone acts in an aggressive manner, you would be able to punish them, not necessarily kick them out of a particular area, but you'd be able to punish them and make it not worth their while. But you would also be able to deny them access or freedom of movement in certain areas. And looking out into the future, the way technology is advancing and the way other militaries are employing that technology, it looks like this may be a more cost-effective strategy in the long run. Because, what we're seeing, in China and Iran and other places around the world is that countries are developing more sophisticated ways of combating our traditional compellence force.
What kind of consensus was there for reducing or increasing some of the most familiar symbols and engines of American power? Aircraft carriers, submarines, stealth bombers, intercontinental missiles?
Sure. So one of the interesting things we saw is that all four teams, very different approaches, they all reduced the number of aircraft carriers from 2 to 4. And that's a significant reduction. Right now we have 11 aircraft carriers in the fleet. But the other interesting thing was they changed the way they were using the aircraft carriers. In some cases, they chose to forward station more carriers than we have right now. And that means the carriers can be out in the world and be useful more of the time. They don't spend as much time in transit between the U.S. and overseas, so you actually get more use out of your carriers when they're forward stationed, so you don't need as many. And we saw other teams basically change the composition of aircraft on the aircraft carriers so that they would be able to strike at longer distances or be more effective and more efficient in their operations. So while we saw everyone reduce the number of carriers, we saw them rebalancing where the carriers are located and the mix of capabilities on them so they wouldn't need as many in the future. When it came to ICBMs, 3 of the 4 teams reduced the number of ICBMs. Those are, a key part of the nuclear triad. But we saw 3 of the 4 teams reduce the ICBM force. 3 of the 4 teams wanted to buy more stealthy bombers in the future. One of the teams wanted to delay that decision a little further into the future. Some significant changes, I think, from the force that we see today.
I've seen stories suggesting that the Air Force, as we know it, should actually be abolished and replaced with air units that are actually part of the Army or Navy with which they must coordinate more closely. What's your view?
Yeah, I guess I don't agree with that, but I'll go ahead and disclose my bias. I'm a former Air Force reserve officer. I've heard calls for that. I've heard calls for the opposite of, maybe the Army giving up all of their aircraft. The truth is right now we actually have 4 Air Forces because you've got the Air Force, the Navy has its own aviation, the Army has its own aviation component, and the Marine Corps fly their own planes as well. And so I think what we saw in this exercise, and I agree with this personally, is we need to eliminate some of the redundancy and overlap between our 4 Air Forces and maybe get more specialized in certain areas.
What about better weapons to wage and defend against cyber war as more and more real-world operations are linked and controlled online? Are we approaching an era of warfare where we don't destroy the enemy's weapons but actually take them over?
Take them over or neutralize them so that they can't even turn them on or employ them. I think we're definitely headed in that direction. And, of course, we have to worry about those same types of cyber weapons being used against our forces. And one of the things that we saw across all of the teams was greater investment in space capabilities and communications capabilities and cyber offense and defense capabilities for the military. And specifically in space capabilities, investing more in what the military calls protected satellite communications. That is, communications that are harder for an adversary to jam, to intercept, or to otherwise get into your data stream and corrupt your data.
Todd Harrison is a senior fellow in defense budget studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments.
Quote from the news, "This is just one more unbelievable chapter in that violin's life." That was Milwaukee concertmaster Frank Almond after police recovered a $5 million 1715 Stradivarius violin pinched in a local parking lot in Milwaukee a month earlier.
Next, from future war to war for ancient art, the Monuments Men, for your ears only.